Okay, I need you to stay with me here because what I'm about to walk you through represents something we haven't seen in the entire post-war era. Not during Suez in 1956. Not during the Iraq War debates in 2003. Not even during the height of tensions over burden sharing or pipeline politics. This is different. At approximately 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time yesterday, a classified diplomatic cable was transmitted from the U.S. mission to NATO in Brussels to the State Department's Operations Center in Washington. The cable, designated notice, no distribution outside the immediate recipient, contained a summary of an emergency session of the North Atlantic Council that had convened without American participation for the first time since the alliance's founding in 1949. The subject of that meeting was whether NATO member states should prepare coordinated economic countermeasures against the United States. Let me say that again so the weight of it lands properly. America's closest military allies, the nations we are treaty-bound to defend, the countries that have stood with us through every major conflict since World War II, held a closed-door session to discuss imposing sanctions on the United States. Now, if you're just hearing about this for the first time, you need to understand why this isn't just another diplomatic dust-up that gets smoothed over with a phone call and a joint statement. This is a structural rupture in the foundation of American global power. And it started with Greenland. Here's what we know happened. 3 weeks ago, during what was characterized as a routine bilateral meeting between the U.S., ambassador to Denmark, and senior officials in Copenhagen, the American side apparently delivered what multiple European sources are now describing as an ultimatum regarding Greenland's status. The specifics remain classified, but according to leaked portions of the diplomatic readout, the message was unambiguous. The United States considers certain strategic interests in Greenland to be non-negotiable. The timeline for addressing these interests is measured in months, not years. And if a diplomatic resolution cannot be reached, alternative mechanisms would be pursued. Now, diplomatic language is usually coded. When diplomats say alternative mechanisms, they typically mean economic pressure, international arbitration, appeals to multilateral bodies. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody in the European foreign policy establishment was prepared for. According to 3 separate sources who have reviewed the cable traffic, the American delegation was asked directly to clarify what alternative mechanisms meant. And the response, delivered by a senior State Department official whose name has not been made public, included explicit reference to the possibility of military assets being repositioned to enforce U.S. security requirements, not military cooperation, not joint exercises, enforcement. The Danish Foreign Ministry reportedly requested clarification of that statement 4 times during the meeting. Each time, according to the sources, the American position was restated without softening. Within 48 hours, the Danish government had briefed the entire Nordic Council. Within 72 hours, emergency consultations had begun in Berlin, Paris, and London. And within 1 week, the North Atlantic Council was convening in secret. Here's what most Americans don't understand about how NATO actually functions. It's not just a military alliance. It's a political commitment built on a single foundational principle. An attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. Article 5 has only been invoked once in NATO's history, September 12, 2001. After the United States was attacked, every NATO member, every single one, committed forces to the response in Afghanistan. Danish soldiers died in Helmand province, defending American security interests. Estonian troops served in combat zones. Norwegian F-16 seconds flew missions over Libya when NATO intervened in 2011. These are not symbolic commitments. These are blood commitments. Greenland is not some disputed territory with unclear sovereignty. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is a founding member of NATO. Under the Washington Treaty, an armed action against Danish territory is legally, formally, unambiguously an attack on the entire alliance. Which means the scenario that European defense ministers are now being forced to plan for quietly, carefully, hoping it never becomes public, is an American military operation that would trigger Article 5 obligations against the United States itself. Think about what that means operationally. If the United States took military action to secure Greenland, and Denmark invoked Article 5, every NATO member would face a choice. honor the treaty and oppose the United States militarily, or break the treaty and destroy the alliance. There is no third option. There is no middle ground. This is a binary that shatters 75 years of transatlantic security architecture. Senator Chris Murphy grasped this immediately. In a floor speech that received almost no American media coverage but was transmitted in full across European news networks, he laid out the nightmare scenario with surgical precision. An American action against Greenland would not just violate Danish sovereignty, it would place U.S. forces in direct confrontation with the very alliance structure that has prevented great power war in Europe for 3 generations. And European governments are taking that threat seriously. Now, here's the part that should genuinely alarm anyone paying attention to how global power actually operates. According to multiple sources familiar with the Brussels discussions, at least 7 NATO members have begun preliminary consultations on what coordinated economic measures would look like if diplomatic efforts fail. This isn't theatrical posturing. This is technical preparation. The European Union's combined GDP exceeds $17 trillion. The EU is the world's largest trading bloc. American companies derive enormous revenue from European markets. U.S. financial institutions are deeply integrated into European banking systems. Supply chains span the Atlantic in both directions. If major European economies began unwinding those relationships simultaneously, the economic consequences for the United States would be severe. Not hypothetical, not distant, immediate and measurable. We're talking about potential tariffs on American goods that could reach 25% or higher, restrictions on U.S. financial institutions operating in European markets, suspension of data sharing agreements that American tech companies depend on, possible freezing of certain categories of American assets held in European banks. One former EU trade official, speaking on background, described the potential measures as designed to inflict maximum economic pain while minimizing harm to European interests. The strategy, if implemented, would target sectors where the United States has the most to lose and Europe has viable alternatives. Agriculture, technology services, defense contracts, energy equipment. These aren't random categories. These are deliberate pressure points. And here's what makes this so dangerous. Once economic warfare begins between allied nations, it doesn't de-escalate cleanly. Tit-for-tat responses become political necessities. Each side has domestic constituencies demanding retaliation. The cycle intensifies. We've seen this pattern before. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 triggered a global trade war that deepened the Great Depression. In 1971, Nixon's unilateral suspension of dollar convertibility shattered the Bretton Woods system and required years of painful negotiation to stabilize. But those were disputes over economic policy, not military threats against Allied territory. This is categorically different. Let me read you something that hasn't been widely reported in American media. Last Tuesday, the German chancellor gave a speech to the Bundestag. The prepared remarks, distributed to the press in advance, contained standard language about transatlantic partnership and shared values. But according to 3 journalists who were in the chamber, the chancellor departed from the script for approximately 4 minutes. And what she said in German was striking. She stated that Germany's commitment to NATO remains absolute. But she also stated that NATO is a defensive alliance bound by international law and the UN Charter. And she made clear that if any member state, regardless of its size or historical leadership role, takes actions that violate those principles, Germany would be forced to reconsider the nature of its obligations. That language might sound diplomatic, but in the context of European political discourse, it's extraordinary. The Chancellor of Germany, the economic engine of Europe, a country whose entire post-war foreign policy has been built on Atlanticism and multilateral institutions, just signaled publicly that there are conditions under which Germany might not automatically support the United States. She was not alone. The French foreign minister, in comments to Le Monde, stated that France would not remain neutral if a NATO member were threatened by another NATO member. The language was careful, but the implication was unmistakable. The Polish government, traditionally one of the most pro-American voices in Europe, issued a statement emphasizing that Article 5 creates mutual obligations that apply equally to all members. Even the United Kingdom, America's closest ally, has been notably restrained. When asked directly whether the UK would support U.S. actions regarding Greenland, the Foreign Secretary stated only that Britain remains committed to international law and the NATO treaty. That's not support. That's evasion. And the evasion itself is the message. Let me step back and explain why this is happening now. Because Greenland isn't just a random territorial obsession. It's actually strategically significant in ways that make this crisis especially dangerous. Greenland sits astride the GUK gap, the Greenland-Iceland-UK corridor through which Russian submarines must pass to reach the Atlantic. Control of Greenland means control of crucial choke points for undersea warfare. During the Cold War, American early warning systems in Greenland provided hours of advance notice for potential Soviet missile launches. Climate change has made Greenland even more valuable. The Arctic is opening. Shipping routes that were icebound for centuries are now navigable for months each year. Greenland possesses rare earth minerals essential for advanced electronics, renewable energy systems, and military hardware. China has been investing heavily in Greenland's economy. Chinese companies have bid on mining projects, infrastructure development, and port facilities. From a strategic perspective, the concern about Chinese influence in Greenland is legitimate. But here's the thing about strategy. The method matters as much as the objective. If the United States wants to counter Chinese influence in Greenland, there are established mechanisms: diplomatic engagement with Denmark, economic development packages, infrastructure investment, multilateral coordination through NATO. What doesn't work, what actively destroys American interests, is threatening military action against a NATO ally to achieve those objectives. Because even if such an action succeeded tactically, even if U.S. forces secured whatever installations or resources are deemed critical, the strategic cost would be catastrophic. NATO would be finished, not weakened, finished. Every nation on Earth would understand that American security guarantees are conditional and revocable based on U.S. interests at any given moment. Every ally would begin hedging. Defense arrangements would be reconsidered. Alternative security architectures would be explored. The economic relationships that undergird American global power, the dollar as reserve currency, the deep integration of U.S. financial markets, the trust that makes international commerce function, all of that depends on predictability, on the belief that the United States operates within a rules-based framework. Threatening military action against an ally shatters that predictability. And once shattered, it cannot be easily restored. Now, let me tell you about the political dynamics inside Washington that make this crisis especially difficult to resolve. Because what's happening isn't just a foreign policy dispute. It's become entangled with domestic political incentives that make de-escalation extraordinarily hard. For certain political constituencies, projecting strength is the highest priority. Backing down, negotiating, accepting constraints, all of that gets characterized as weakness. And in the current political environment, the charge of weakness is often more damaging than the charge of recklessness. Which means that even if advisors are privately warning about the catastrophic consequences of escalation, the political cost of appearing to retreat may feel higher than the strategic cost of continuing forward. This is how rational actors end up making irrational decisions. Not because they don't understand the risks, but because the domestic political incentives overwhelm the strategic calculus. Members of Congress who understand the danger are caught in their own trap. If they speak out too forcefully against the threats toward Greenland, they risk being labeled as weak on China, soft on national security, insufficiently supportive of American interests. But if they remain silent, they become complicit in a course of action that could destroy the Atlantic Alliance and trigger an economic crisis. Several senators have tried to thread this needle by calling for renewed diplomatic engagement while also emphasizing the importance of Greenland strategically. But that middle position satisfies no one and provides no actual break on escalation. The result is paralysis, The very people who have the constitutional authority to check executive overreach in foreign policy are finding it politically impossible to do so. All right, let me bring this down from geopolitics to what it actually means for people's lives. Because constitutional crises and alliance fractures sound abstract until they affect your paycheck, your retirement account, your sense of security. If Europe imposes serious economic countermeasures, American consumers feel it immediately. European tariffs on American goods mean American companies lose market share. That means layoffs. Manufacturing jobs disappear. Agricultural exports decline. The dollar's value could weaken if European central banks begin reducing dollar reserves. That makes imports more expensive. Gas prices rise, consumer goods cost more, real wages decline. American companies that depend on European supply chains face disruptions. The automotive sector, technology, manufacturing, pharmaceutical production, all of these industries have deep European integration. If that integration is severed, production slows, prices increase, innovation suffers. And then there's the financial sector. American banks hold enormous European assets. European banks hold enormous American assets. If those relationships sour, if trust breaks down, credit markets tighten. Borrowing becomes more expensive for everyone. Small businesses can't get loans. Mortgages become harder to obtain. This isn't fear-mongering. This is how economic integration works. When you build deeply interconnected systems over decades, you create mutual dependencies. Those dependencies make everyone richer in good times. But they also mean that conflict creates cascading failures. Young people trying to start careers would face a job market severely damaged by a transatlantic economic rupture. Retirement savings invested in markets that depend on global stability would take hits. Families trying to afford college or health care would find those costs rising as economic growth slows. None of this is inevitable, but all of it becomes more likely if the current trajectory continues. European governments have made clear, through diplomatic channels, that they are willing to engage in intensive negotiations over Greenland's future. They've proposed a framework that would address American security concerns while respecting Danish sovereignty. The framework reportedly includes provisions for expanded U.S. military access, joint infrastructure development, and coordinated responses to Chinese economic influence. In other words, there's a deal available. A deal that gives the United States most of what it wants strategically without triggering a NATO crisis. But accepting that deal requires acknowledging that Denmark has legitimate rights that must be respected. It requires negotiation rather than diktat. It requires treating allies as partners rather than obstacles. If that diplomatic path is pursued seriously, this crisis can still be contained. The damage can be limited. The alliance can survive. But if the current trajectory continues, if ultimatums are followed by deadlines, if military repositioning begins, if threats become actions, then we are looking at something genuinely unprecedented. The European Union has scheduled an emergency summit for next month. The agenda, officially, is economic coordination. But sources indicate that contingency planning for economic countermeasures will be a central topic. NATO defense ministers are scheduled to meet in 3 weeks. That meeting will either be an opportunity for de-escalation or the moment when the alliance formally fractures. We are not in the aftermath of a crisis. We are in the escalation phase. And the people who have the power to de-escalate are, so far, choosing not to. Let me leave you with the fundamental question that will determine how this ends. Does the United States still believe that operating within a rules-based international order serves American interests? Or has the calculation shifted to the belief that American power is sufficient to achieve objectives without allied support or institutional constraints? That's not a partisan question. It's not about any particular administration. It's about how America understands its role in the world going forward. For 75 years, the answer was clear. American power was most effective when exercised through institutions, with allies, within agreed-upon rules. That approach made America wealthy, secure, and influential beyond what raw military power alone could achieve. If the answer has changed, if the new calculation is that institutions constrain more than they enable, that allies are burdens rather than assets, that rules apply to others but not to the United States, then we're entering genuinely uncharted territory. The Greenland crisis will reveal which understanding prevails. And that revelation will shape not just this particular dispute, but the entire structure of international relations for decades to come. Subscribe if you want to follow this as it develops. Hit the like button if you understand why this matters. Share this with anyone who needs to understand that the world order we've taken for granted is being tested in real time. The institutions are holding, for now. The question is whether they'll still be holding next month.